Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the Civicas Forum on Civic Space in Los Angeles. I'm Cynthia Hirschhorn, and I founded Civicas Women's Civic Action Network, a group of LA women leaders across sectors, including education, foundations, government, nonprofits, and businesses, who are passionate about civic engagement. Our goal is to create opportunities to learn about civic scale issues, connect with local leaders, and support positive change in our communities to help make our city more healthy and equitable for all. During today's webinar, Civic Space in LA, past, present, and post-pandemic, distinguished experts and leaders in city and county of Los Angeles will explore some of the equity issues surrounding civic spaces, including parks, streets, and neighborhoods that have been exposed by the pandemic. Panelists will share their research, policy, and implementation perspectives, and we will invite attendees to follow up with potential ways to participate, as we hope this will be the beginning of a productive and continuing conversation with the public. I want to thank today's co-hosts, the Southern California Institute of Architecture, especially Natasha Neufeld, and the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs, and their Center for Innovation, and the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies, as well as their ED of External Affairs, Nicole Payton. As an environmental designer and Civicas founder, I spend lots of time thinking about civic space, both physical and virtual. And when I earned my master's degree in architecture at UCLA, architecture and urban planning were taught together in the same school. So I'm especially excited to moderate today's panels with experts in urban planning, urban design, and architecture, discussing together some equitable solutions for a healthy city in which all can thrive. Here's how today will work. The speakers will briefly introduce themselves and their work. Then I will ask each to describe some of the equity issues they see surrounding civic space in LA. There will be a few examples of positive solutions and next steps, and we hope to engage the panelists in a lively group discussion. We have an amazing and diverse group of participants watching as well, so look forward to audience Q&A. And please ask your questions in the chat section, and feel free to offer answers as well, as our intention today is to share information and inspire conversation. And now it is my honor to introduce our panel. Norma Edith Garcia-Gonzalez, the Director of LA County Parks and Recreation. Anastasia Lecaitu-Sideris, Associate Dean of UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs and Professor of Urban Planning. And Barbara Romero, who's the Deputy Mayor of City Services, City of LA, is actually meeting with the mayor as we speak and will be on shortly. Marika Trotter is the architect and professor of architectural history at SCI-Arc. And Mark Valiantos, executive officer of innovation, LA Metro and Office of Extraordinary Innovation, seems to have been in traffic. So now, if you would all like to introduce yourselves briefly, and then we will start with the questions, yourselves and your work. Norma, would you like to start? Or Anastasia, actually, would you like to start?
Sure. So hi, everyone, and thank you, Cynthia and Civicas, for organizing this panel. I want to say that as cities around the country begin to reopen, we need to examine how we can safely regain use of some critical settings of our everyday lives, our neighborhood public spaces, our streets and our parks. And these spaces are important amenities in our cities, and they are even more significant now than before the pandemic. They allow people to come out of their isolation, to walk, to cycle, exercise, feel that they're part of a community. The pandemic has been brutal for some groups in particular. It has decimated the lives of older adults. It has disproportionately hit lower income and minority households. It has increased the fear of accessing public spaces. It has furthered social isolation. So how to make congregating in public spaces possible, comfortable, and safe again? And how do we privilege vulnerable groups to have better access to public spaces? I'm very glad that we have people on the panel who are putting a lot of thought on these issues. As we're getting ready to reopen our cities, we have to adapt to the new normal of physical distancing. Some spatial interventions will be very helpful. One of them is the designation of open or slow streets, which privilege people over cars. New York has already dedicated 7 miles of streets to pedestrians and cyclists, plans to do up to 100 miles. In Los Angeles, we have also seen open space designations, but much less in dense inner city neighborhoods where they're sorely needed. Additionally, I would say that open streets require more than banning or slowing down cars. Streets should become more walkable and pedestrian friendly. They should be retrofitted with benches and trees. A variety of design means, such as sun umbrellas, canopies, pedestrian lighting, bus shelters, even flower boxes can make these streets more livable, humane. Fixing the cracked sidewalk pavement would allow older adults to walk without the fear of falling. Retrofitting store parking lots so that they have more shade, but also can accommodate outdoor shopping, can help many avoid the feared indoor spaces. Using cool sidewalk paving materials can help lower the extremely high summer temperatures. So I would propose 4 principles for public space during this historical moment. The first principle asks that we reconsider the distribution of space in ways that prioritize the needs of vulnerable groups. This may involve, for example, designating seniors-only settings at popular parks and beaches for the exclusive use of older adults, with benches spaced safely apart for socializing, or allotting the first car of every subway train during certain hours of the day, or the front section of the bus for vulnerable groups. The second principle relates to temporality and considers how public spaces can be used differently over the course of the day. This is called layering and separation, layering activities appealing to different groups in parks during different times of the day, thus creating less crowded space where different groups can venture to without the fear of disease. The third principle relates to the use of smart technologies in public space. For example, solar shade umbrellas tracking the sun can offer shade protection throughout the day in very hot weather. Smart benches providing heating in cold weather, new tensile technologies with solar reflecting materials and cool pavements can offer better comfort in inner city public spaces. The last principle relates to the provision of a psychologically positive and inclusive atmosphere where vulnerable groups can feel safe and welcome. This means offering design interventions and programming opportunities for public space activities to people of different abilities, ages, and cultures. These 4 principles pretty much define part of my work on public spaces, but they're only a first step towards imagining a better urban future, even in a world where disease becomes a frequent risk. And so as we're looking to a period of reorganizing our built environment and social world, we should also reconsider how we can combat the lingering fear that remains and threatens our public spaces and our well-being and health. Thank you.
Thank you. Marika?
So, Cynthia, would you like us to just introduce ourselves now, or should we say all of our things?
You can introduce yourself and share your slides and about your work, and then we will.
Okay. So, first of all, Cynthia, thank you so much for giving us this opportunity. I feel really privileged to be in the company of such erudite and dynamic women. As you said, I am the equivalent of a professor of architectural history and theory at the Southern California Institute of Architecture, who is the co-host for this event. And I run the history and theory programs and the curriculum at that school. And so my own work tends to deal with pretty deep history, pretty old stuff. Most of my work takes place in the 1700s and 1800s, and perhaps has to do with a different scale of a question than the one that we're confronting today. But one thing that I've had the privilege of in the course of my academic career is I've had the privilege to travel a great deal and see cities all around the world. And perhaps that helps me understand the uniqueness of our situation here in Los Angeles as the entire world faces an unprecedented global reckoning with the way that we have prioritized certain intangibles that benefit the few over and above the tangibles and specifics that would benefit the community as a whole. So actually, if I could, I wanted to share some slides. And I also wanted to say, is that okay if I do that? I also wanted to say that I'm speaking today not just as a representative of SCI-Arc, but also as the collaborator and a partner of Tom Wiscombe Architecture. And he actually and I have been having an ongoing conversation about what specific architectural strategies we think might work for Los Angeles at this moment going forward. And so I'm going to show you some of the sketches that he did together with our ideas about it. Let me share my screen. Can you guys all see that?
Yes.
Okay. So, you know, they say in science that the coronavirus is a wicked problem. And we probably all know what that means, as we've all had to become more scientifically literate. But a wicked problem is a problem that has so many different factors involved and contains such large and overlapping spheres of influence, ranging from people's dietary needs to policy to economics to physical spaces, that wicked problems are quite difficult for one discipline to solve. But when they say there's a wicked problem, scientists will often counter with, well, a wicked problem needs a virtuous solution. And so I want to talk to you guys today about what a virtuous solution from an architectural perspective might look like. And I'm going to describe I don't have 4 ideas, Anastasia, you're way ahead of me, but I have 3 maybe loose concepts to throw out. And these are mega courtyards, tiny streets, and what we're going to call stacked obliques, at least for the time being. So we know this is basically what a wicked problem looks like. And this is what makes it so difficult to deal with the situation that we're in. There is actually a really funny slideshow running around the internet right now that talks about the specific wickedness of the problem of COVID-19. And you can see all of these insane arrows pointing to the complexity of the problem in front of us. And one of the issues with the virtuous solutions are being proposed for this wicked problem and all of the other things that get ensnared into it is that many of them remain at the level of general ideas, and they are not then translated with the kind of creative effort and the kind of creative mind into specific, sticky, memorable solutions that have specific form. So this is something actually that architects can help with, because although we cannot disciplinarily claim any expertise in matters of policy and in matters of governance, we can participate as informed citizens, as all of us can, but we don't have specific expertise in that. What we do have expertise in is building specific, memorable solutions. So, first idea that we've been contemplating in our office is this notion of mega courtyards. Mega courtyards beginning to respond to something Anastasia was talking about. How do we create more local types of civic and public space that can operate according to a kind of layered notion of time, where they can be activated in different ways at different times? And of course, we have many examples of these in other parts of the world. I'm showing you the Museumsquartier in Vienna here, which is a good example of a space that is it's enclosed. That's critical. It's enclosed on all sides. So it's a pocket of civic space. It's larger in scale than a typical domestic courtyard, which has a limited civic function and tends to feel more like an extension of a kind of private court or a private yard or a private patio. But instead, it begins to function at the scale of the city and can have very different feels at very different times of the day. feel like a space that all people can participate in. There are other examples at a variety of scales in many of the older cities of Europe. Not that there are sort of magical, no, I don't want to be too nostalgic about this. It's not that these are magical solutions, even though I'm showing you beautiful twinkling lights and fancy chairs, but that they are old solutions, and they tend to be better built in old cities. So for example, the extremely old palace complex of the Alhambra in Granada in Spain, which is of course a Moorish palace complex, features an amazing set of differently scaled courtyards strung one next to the other. And this might be an idea that would be worth reconsidering when we look at LA's urban fabric, which is of course laid out via large blocks on a grid, and therefore would accommodate the kind of densification that a mega courtyard would involve. Just to go back, this is a courtyard that is actually a series of connected courtyard spaces in Lisbon that works in the same way. It's a shared space, it's an overlooked space, and it's a bounded space that creates a greater sense of connectivity at the same time that it provides fresh air, which is so critical now and moving forward. And of course, just one famous courtyard from Paris, because it would be nice to be able to go to Paris right now. Of course.
I just wanted to interrupt you for 1 second, because we are going to get back to this, but we were doing a quick intro of all of,
I'm sorry.
and if you could just go through the ideas a little quickly, then we can, everyone will have a chance, and I wanted to be able to talk about how this might play out in our city.
Can do. Let me actually go back to my initial slide, and I'll just stop there for now. Forgive me. So I've just talked a bit about mega courtyards, and I'll finish up with that later. But an analogous idea and a complementary idea would be to densify certain areas of our streets in Los Angeles. This is not the same as simply slow streets or pedestrian-friendly streets, because it would involve physical change. It would mean that we would have certain vehicular streets that maintain certain widths for vehicles and for the transport of goods and people, but that adjacent to those spaces, we could also start to densify some of our blocks in Los Angeles with smaller scale streets that would still allow for the passage of light and air and be a healthier place for people to gather, and a slower paced area of the city, but would create pockets away from the kind of relentless vehicular prioritization that we have experienced so intensively in Los Angeles. And last but not least, I'll have to talk about this with pictures, but the idea of a stacked oblique would be something like thinking more vertically when it comes to civic space in Los Angeles. We in Los Angeles are used to a horizontal sprawl that is fairly undifferentiated when it comes to verticals. But if you think about how spaces might step and overlap, or how they might ramp and even provide certain levels of shade and roofing, as well as higher level civic plazas in the city, that might be a really great way for us to invest in denser public space, which we have disinvested from in the United States and in many other areas of the world with astonishing and rapacious force. So I'll stop there for now. I'm sorry for droning on.
No, thank you. They were beautiful pictures, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, because those are some of the ideas that the C40 mayors have come up with as well. I wanted to give Norma a chance to talk about parks for a minute, and I will share the screen for you. Hold on. Okay. Norma, can everyone see that screen?
Not yet, but I can start talking, Cynthia. And hello, everyone. And once again, Cynthia, it's so wonderful to join these amazing scholars and to have them actually set the context in regards to Los Angeles and envisioning a place of justice, a place where all of us can enjoy the beauty and nature of parks, regardless of neighborhood. I wanted to just set my 3 minutes in context. This week, the Prevention Institute came out with a research synopsis that I really think shapes the core of how parks and open space is so critical to Los Angeles County. They made a link between park access and life expectancy. So if you haven't seen this research synopsis, Park Equity, Life Expectancy, and the Power of Building, it really is moving to see actual data linking park access to life expectancy. 2, I wanted to share that I've been on various calls twice a month with colleagues around the country regarding how parks and open space have been a refuge for respite, for physical and emotional and social well-being through this COVID. And we have seen record numbers of visitors at our parks, from our local small parks to our regional parks. 3rd, I want to just mention what we've also have seen that is really has risen to the surface is that if you are living in a community that is park rich, you have access to additional essential services that have been provided by parks. And you can leave that there, Cynthia, that's perfect. By parks during COVID. And just to give you some examples, in LA County parks, we provided 88,000 meals to youth 18 years of under from the months of June to August. We've provided cooling centers for families who do not have air conditioning. And we've heard all the way from people that live even in the coastal areas, but you're thinking about the North counties, the eastern portions of the county, and the extreme heat that they felt. And parks have been a sanctuary for cooling centers. We've also partnered with the LA Food Bank and have provided 22,000 households with meals and food for the entire week, in addition to the essential services of providing homeless shelters. I can go on and on about all of the services that parks have been provided, essential services to really sustain our communities through COVID. And this leads me to this slide, and that's fine. LA County Parks and Recreation did this significant groundbreaking study in 2016, and I share with you that we are at every census committed to updating this data. We partnered with every park and recreation agency in the county to actually acquire data, and we inventoried every public parcel of land that is dedicated to park and open space. And we created a park needs assessment. And this is absolutely key, because when you think about who exacerbating racial, environmental, and justice, we look at the communities that have been burdened the most by COVID. They're also the communities who have less access to the essential services that are being provided by parks. And 2, you have less space, and where people can have that physical, that emotional respite that parks have been providing so many throughout the country. And so I wanted just to center this equity conversation in regards to park space, because this was a signature study that we want to ensure continues to be a focal point of conversation in regards to racial, environmental, and park and open space access. And last, I just wanted to share one equity initiative that we partnered, and I think this goes to Anastasia's comment. Those communities, you saw the communities, if you go to the next slide, we chose 10 communities that are the very high park poor communities. And what we did is we partnered with Public Works, we partnered with the transportation agencies, Metro, to reroute and to close off streets around the park. So we actually created miles of route, not slow streets. We actually closed off streets for no vehicular access. And so that families in those park poor communities, in those red areas, can come out in their neighborhood with their strollers, in their bicycles, in their skateboards, or just even walk. We saw people and elderly that were dancing in the streets because they were so happy to have that physical distance and being out, because they had been cooped up in their home. And I wanted to center this conversation about how critical our park and open spaces are to everyday people, and especially in significant trying times. And back to you, Cynthia, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you so much. Well, since we don't have Barbara on yet and we don't have Mark, I wanted to talk about some of the statistics and things that I wanted to bring up in that regard. Because first, before we begin the rest of the program, I want to take a moment to note that the entire region of LA sits on indigenous lands and acknowledge the Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tomagar. And today, in addition to what you've already brought up, some of these questions that we wanted to address were, how can urban design affect public health and economics and education and civic life? And how can our streets, which are the primary open spaces in many areas, better accommodate a variety of community needs like you've suggested? And again, how do we reach impacted communities? Because we know that all of this is not spread equally amongst our communities. So again, then how does everyone feel invested in civic space in all the different areas? Because some people aren't even aware of some of the opportunities and options available that I think Barbara will speak to when she talks about the Alfresco program. And the other thing that we want to note is that this pandemic has exposed environmental inequities and climate injustice, but that these are not new issues, and in fact have been designed into our urban environments to disproportionately affect communities of color. The urgency of this moment gives us hope that we can collaborate on clean, blue, and green economic development to spur infrastructure investments as well as neighborhood interventions. But this summer, there were lots of articles, and we've posted a lot on the Civicas website about whether it was how our infrastructure was designed for the freeways going through certain neighborhoods or redlining in different neighborhoods. And we think that Los Angeles is a very kind of diverse melting pot, but in fact, we've seen that the way our built environment has been structured has created a lot of different neighborhoods with different inequities that are associated with it, that are again, the ones that have been exposed during this pandemic, from health consequences to park availability to all sorts of different economic challenges. So another statistic I wanted to share was that urban environmental factors impact public health in many ways, physically, economically, and socially. Approximately 67% of an individual's health is dictated by factors outside of genetics and medical care. So that means the built environment and their personal circumstances and the increasing influence of climate change play a significant role in individual health. So this is not just a question of neighborhood beautification and public safety even, it's really a public health question. So I was going to ask you each to share some of the equity issues that you see in the civic spaces and how they came to be, but you've also already touched on that. So I would also then talk about some of the recent solutions and potential next steps that might spur some of our participants to also have questions. So if you will indulge me, I'll do a few more statistics and a little more education about it. For example, I don't know how many of our participants know about C40, which is an organization of mayors around the world from cities who have come together to convene and collaborate on best practices. And our own mayor, Mayor Eric Garcetti, is the chair of this group. And they have recently put out an agenda for a green and just recovery. And that program outlines bold steps to deliver an equitable and sustainable recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. Because as we all know, when we come back together, it's not going to be the way it was before, nor should it necessarily. So specific measures outlined in this agenda focus on creating green jobs and investing in crucial public services, protecting mass transit and supporting essential workers, giving public spaces back to people and nature, and reclaiming our streets and guaranteeing clean air to ensure livable local communities. I'd like to introduce a few ideas that they suggest and hear how each of you would respond to that and how we're dealing with that in our city. One way that they talk about doing this is creating 15-minute cities, where all residents of the city are able to meet most of their needs within a short walk or bicycle ride from their homes. And giving streets back to people by permanently reallocating more road space to walking and cycling, and investing in citywide walking and cycling networks and green infrastructure. building with nature to prioritize nature-based solutions such as parks, green roofs, green walls, blue infrastructure, permeable pavements like Anastasia mentioned, to help reduce the risks of extreme heat and drought and flooding, and improve livability and physical and mental health. And as we have seen, changes like these can only be accomplished by collaborating across disciplines as a standard of practice. So again, I hope when Barbara gets here, she talks about the alfresco program as an example of that. That was something that the departments from all across the city came together to address a need and just solve the problems and make it happen as a temporary solution that we hope will become public. But again, was not actually distributed equitably in all neighborhoods for a variety of reasons. So one other little note I want to make about some statistics about streets and parks before you all weigh in is that 14% of LA's counties' incorporated land is devoted to parking. 9,300 miles of sidewalks are in our city. 28,000 lanes of mile lanes of streets, which is 15 to 20% of our public space in Los Angeles. So how can we think differently about that space in terms of neighborhoods and the collective commons? And in parks, in terms of LA parks, what Norma was mentioning is that LA's 2020 park score is 49 out of 100 largest cities in the United States. We think we're a big open city, but in fact, we're 49th in terms of parks. That means that acres of parks per 1,000 people in LA neighborhoods showcase the inequity like she was discussing. White people have access to 31.8 acres, African Americans 1.7 acres, and Latino 0.6 acres. So more than 600 parks in LA cover about 13% of all city land, but almost 4 in 10 people in LA lack a park within close walking distance of their home. And as she said, despite these inequities in park access, we've seen increased need to provide basic essential services and social and emotional connections. So I'd like you each, if you can, to address some of the recent solutions. Again, hoping for the alfresco program and slow streets, but also parklets and distant learning center sites at rec centers, and also how we could think about making some of these solutions more permanent. Because I know that there's something else that Mayor Garcetti is talking about, the 10-minute walk campaign, where he has pledged to adopt long-term system-wide strategies to make sure every Los Angeles resident has access to all the benefits parks provide, and endorse this vision that everyone deserves a park or open space within a 10-mile walk of home. Some examples of this might be the Rio Hondo confluence area located in Southeast LA at the confluence of the river that one group I'm working with, River LA, is also working on. So panelists, now I will turn it back to you, and I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on these things.
I can start if you like. I want to say that certainly the pandemic brought into, sharp relief these inequities, but these have been in existence for decades. And I think we really, as planners, designers, policymakers, we really need to start looking at our spaces of everyday lives. And I'm even though my area is urban design, I'm very critical of urban design in the sense that it really mostly focused on the prime spaces of the city. And we really need, how many bus stops have a bus shelter? We have inner city neighborhoods. Some of them are quite, supermarkets are quite close. They are in a mixed use environment. They have a lot of bus stops. I was doing work with older minority groups in Westlake. There are close to 3 parks. They do not go to these parks. They're afraid, the sidewalks are awful. They're afraid they're going to fall. There is trash. So I guess my point in all this is to say that we really need to focus on some of our spaces of everyday life and make them more livable and humane. If you look into Vermont Street, there are no trees. The average life of a tree in the inner city neighborhood is only 5 years. There have been efforts in the past, and I'm I hear that there are new efforts again to build, to plant more trees, but it is not simply planting a tree. You have to water it to maintain it. And, you know, there are responsibilities that the city has to do. I would say thank God for parks, and I'm delighted that Norma is at the helm, because I know that she's going to address some of the inequities. We still really need to, and parks are sorely needed in all areas, but primarily I would say in inner city areas where households lack private open spaces, backyards, or they cannot register their kids to soccer clubs or pay for ballet dances and all that. But even if you look into the inequities of, let's say, age inequities, I mean, we have a population that is aging, right? Older people, older minority groups are underrepresented in parks. So how do we bring them? What things do we offer them? What programs do we offer them? So these are all the things that we really need to consider. And of course, now with the added challenge of the pandemic, of how do you do that without bringing people, you know, making them, making it easier to get the disease. So these are some of my comments about what you said, Cynthia.
Norma?
And thank you, Anastasia. I want to first acknowledge that one of for me, the solutions continues to be that we really need to come together to really advocate and build a constituency of how important our green spaces and these public spaces are, especially to our communities of color who lack severely any green space. I think there are wonderful solutions that all of you in LA County have put forth. And I just wanted to mention that in 2014, LA County went out with a Proposition P for parks, and it was voted down by the voters. That gave us an opportunity to come back and put forth Measure A. And I want to acknowledge, because I know that former council member Ed Reyes is listening to us and was a staunch champion to make sure that this was the first equity measure passed in Los Angeles County around parks and open space. So I want to say that allows us, there's funding in perpetuity to actually acquire and build infrastructure. But as Anastasia mentioned, it's if you build the purchasing of land, the developing of parks or open spaces is one part. Making sure that they're safe, making sure that they're clean, and making sure that they're accessible with sidewalks, public transportation, and all the elements are very integral to planning. And I think this is what's so wonderful about the urban planning profession, that we don't see ourselves as planners for parks, but when we look at planning, we really think about all of the connections that help to create community linkages to our open spaces. So I want to say that a solution is, we've put forth a collective solution already to pass the first equity measure that focuses on investment in parks. The second piece is to make sure that this is high on our advocacy radar. We know now with the Prevention Institute, park access equals, a higher life expectancy. I mean, that should shake us to our core. Two, we know that, how critical parks have been just to the average person in dealing with crisis. And three, we now know that if you're Black and if you're brown, you're less likely to have access to open space. So I think we've got the policy initiatives in our hands. I think it's really about coming together to make sure that we make those critical investments in the places that need to be invested in. And I do just want to plug for LA County, the supervisors, LA County Parks took about a 14% reduction in budget. Hi, Barbara. But the number one priority that we were restored was in grounds maintenance, in our maintenance. So I just want to put a plug in regards to making sure that we make the critical investments where they need to be made.
Cynthia, should we let Barbara introduce herself?
Yes, I am. I'm just reading. Okay, hi Barbara. Thank you so much for joining us. I know you've just met with the mayor, so really appreciate it. We did.
So I'm on my phone and I'm in with Jennifer's link.
Okay, well, we just want to hear whatever you want to share with us. We've been talking about inequity in park and civic spaces and mentioning the alfresco program as an example of ways that the city has come together to implement some things on a part-time temporary basis, and how that's showcased some of the inequities and what we might be able to do to make things more permanent. But whatever you would like to share with us, we would appreciate.
So I'm sure I'm sure the group has already covered. So I just want to say whatever, I echo what the group has already talked about. From my perspective, I want to, can you hear me?
Yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I just wanted you to introduce yourself also and what your job is within the city.
Oh, okay. So I'm Barbara Romero, and I'm the Deputy Mayor of City Services for Eric Garcetti. I oversee 15 departments for him. And since I started, I've been pegged as the back to basics deputy mayor. And since I started, the mayor has basically asked me to work on focusing on, since the recession, we weren't investing in infrastructure. So he basically said, let's focus on equitable investments. So we've always known, for example, that tree canopy equity was a problem. Now we know that we now have data showing exactly that we need to target and we need to focus those investments in those communities by 50%. We know that 1% of neighborhoods have most of the tree canopy. We know, like in our street furniture contract, for example, that our transit shelters contract is in our previous contracts before, it was basically on advertising. And now we're saying it should be based on transit ridership. Before our sidewalk contracts, we were spending over 30 million, we're spending $30 million a year to restore our city contract, our sidewalk program. But we weren't spending any money on small businesses. So now we're carving out money to specifically focus on small businesses. Why? Because those small businesses are usually small business, small minority businesses, are great streets. How do we get, we always talk about how do we work with communities? How do we target communities? We always want, we know that we have, and I'm sure somebody has talked about, and Norma probably talked about how we're not investing enough in certain communities. But when we do target certain communities, it always becomes from the top down. So our Great Streets program basically goes to communities and tells communities, it's a bottom up approach. You tell us what you need in your community. It's an outreach based approach. What do you want in your community? And it's like, do you want in your sidewalks? Do you want trees? Do you want street furniture? What kind of improvements do you want? So so we need to make some long-term investments in our disadvantaged communities. But what I wanted to say, it's not going to be easy. It's a long-term commitment. And but this is the right time to do it. And it takes people like myself who grew up in these neighborhoods to be in these positions of influence to kind of do it. So happy to be here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'd like to open it up to some questions from the audience as well as some group discussion. One question that someone was asking was from Ryan Caro, was that given that parks are often a place of policing, particularly of unhoused Black and brown people, is it possible to design inequity out of public space without removing police first? We did do a Civicas panel earlier this summer on policing, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, especially Norma.
And that has been a significant topic for us recently. As a matter of fact, I do want to mention that we have always taken very seriously the relationship between law enforcement and parks. we want to make sure that our parks are safe. That is the #1 priority of park constituents and users. At the same time, our parks need to be spaces where everyone is respected. And so one is we have a park sheriff bureau dedicated to parks, where we do specialized training with our law enforcement. And just to give you an example, after the murder of George Floyd, we had about over 23 protest demonstrations in LA County parks that range from 50 people to 5,000 people. And we immediately engaged in how was law enforcement gonna support in our parks the First Amendment and the right to free speech. And so one, we worked very closely with law enforcement and said no riot gear. We actually wanted law enforcement to be in their equestrian units so that the presence is much more less harsh. And as a matter of fact, we even developed a team so that we coordinated with all of the demonstrators, organizers in advance. For our Parks After Dark program, we coordinate with our law enforcement so that they are not just the black and blue standing in the corner, checking out who's good and who's bad, but they're out there engaging with our community, playing, interacting, really building that community policing. So I want to share with you, one, we did not have one arrest or one significant incident while having thousands and thousands of demonstrators. And we're very proud of that because our park spaces are spaces to really lift our voices up about what's happening in our society. But two, the careful balancing of making sure that our law enforcement partner adopts a community policing model that is there to lift up, to engage, to build relationships with the community, and not to deter this community. And so I will say that we continue to engage in this effort. We are talking at this very moment, how do our Park Sheriff Bureau, how do we dedicate much more training so that, and perhaps looking at other creative models that are happening around the country that we can learn from, so that one, we have this partnership with the community. Most important to us is not just the safety, but the well-being and that our community members feel welcomed and also safe from police at our parks. And so that balance is very critical and important to my department, and we're very engaged in every sense of this work.
Thank you for sharing that. We were fortunate enough to have Connie Rice on our previous panel who developed that model. And, we were also talking about Friday Night Lights and some of the other kind of programs that our participants may be aware of, and how projects like that begin, and then how can they become more permanent fixtures in the community. So I will ask another question from Deborah Ermis, talking about, can eminent domain be considered for taking over golf courses? And I know that was in the paper recently, and we had also put that article on our site, but about planting trees, building outdoor theaters, making this space for everyone. There were public as well as private courses. So do you have any thoughts on that? Anybody?
I do. I have I oversee parks as well, so I have an opinion on it. Parks, golf courses serve also, they generate revenue, and in this time of a budget crisis, if you ask our general manager right now, that's some of the only revenue that we're generating right now. So it actually helps then serve for us to serve some of the areas, some of the other funding. It's like the only funding that we have right now. So it does help alleviate the RAPS budget. So I think it serves a purpose for the department. So that's one perspective that I think is important to look at as well. I know above and beyond the other things. So I'll let Norma answer another perspective.
And I don't want golfs to dominate the conversation, but just really quickly, public golf systems were created as a response for the segregation that happened in affluent private golf courses. So I just want to set the stage that we're very proud that Chester Washington Golf Course was the African American PGA course for LA County. So African Americans throughout the country that had not in the professional circuit that did not have access to playing golf used to come to LA County and Chester Washington to play, and we still have a long history. We have also one of our golf courses is named after also Maggie Hathaway, also a PGA first African American champion. And so I want to state that there is a significant difference between public and private golf courses. Second of all, our golf courses, many are in significant ecological areas. And so the flora and fauna, the blue line streams, are a responsibility that that we take seriously in regards to making sure that our trees and landscapes are maintained. And lastly, to Barbara's point, I keep saying that if you play a round of golf in a public golf course, whether it be the city of LA and LA County, you are investing in recreation programs for Black and Brown youth in LA County and in the city. So we want our users to remember that play public golf courses. One, there's it's an investment it's an investment made in our youth.
I do think, though, that it's interesting that the conversation immediately went to public golf courses. I would say it is perhaps an indication that we need to be able to imagine even more broadly than we're used to, because I believe that the original question was perhaps targeting private golf courses. Eminent domain is not something that we use actively in the United States. It's very rare for us to use eminent domain in recent times, perhaps as a hangover from what happened with the injustices associated with eminent domain seizure of land for the highway system. But I think the time has come to actually take up that tool again.
I also want to add one thing in parallel to the discussion of the golf courses, that while it's wonderful to have large open spaces, in dense inner city environments, you typically do not have the space. And I think, on the other hand, there are a lot of empty fenced lots, surface parking lots that used to be parked, etc. And you can definitely create even temporary little oases in the city, small spaces. The most recent Golden Age Park that the Neighborhood Land Trust put in Westlake is 1/3 of an acre. It has opportunities for gardening. It has opportunities for exercise. So if you start thinking retrofitting our inner city neighborhoods with finding these opportunities of what I used to call lost space or cracks in the city, I think you give quite a lot of, you meet a lot of needs of some of these neighborhoods. And I think we should really look into that as well.
I mean, I think I would love to see, I mean, I think there's a lot of other places that legally, if you look at private golf courses, the people who are part of it would legally would have a lot of money and would put a lot of legal challenges against it. I would want to go into more underutilized facilities to put our efforts in those, because those are actually underutilized. Those, you know, those private golf courses, people are utilizing, and people with a lot of money, it's going to be harder to legally challenge to get those. So let's go get those parcels that are underutilized, that would be more feasible to get to convert into public lands.
That brings me to, you know, another question by Carrie Norton is talking about how do we all think about forecasted growing impacts of climate change, namely heat, as we consider public design solutions. Heat will continue to have an impact on livability in parks and outdoor spaces, and she'd like to hear how we think about that in our designs and planning. We were talking before about some of these solutions of parklets, and even with the alfresco program, Barbara, you had mentioned the, you know, as we move into the winter months and, you know, in different neighborhoods, they don't have access to umbrellas or the tree canopies. And before you came on, I was saying it's not just an idea about beautification or even public safety with streetlights. It's really public health that we're talking about, because we know that access to open space is directly related to obesity and all sorts of other health challenges. So how can we take these spaces that we can have been identified that are vacant lots or city lots or whatever, and as we've started to do, and I was talking before you came on about the alfresco program being a great proof of concept of the way that we have come together across different departments in the city to make these improvements in neighborhoods at the neighborhood level.
Well, I can start responding to that, and I'm sure others would too. I mean, I think it is undeniable that we're facing climate change, and here in California, in the midst of fires and heat and all that, so I think we should take it very seriously. We should also look into some smart technologies, and there are a number of technologies that can go, and actually Norma knows because she had once asked me to give a talk about a smart toolkit in parks and all these sprinklers, the water meters, and how we can be more energy efficient and this and that. But, or, the cool, how do you create cool pavements? So technology is one way, but the other way is to try to very much enrich the urban forest. I mean, we do know that trees bring down considerably the micro temperatures, and we have a lot of our inner city trees that are completely devoid of trees, of street trees. And so I don't want to repeat myself, but I think that we really need to notice all that and start retrofitting some of the hottest areas in our city with more greenery.
If I could just add to what Anastasia is saying, I also think that in addition to the planting of more trees, which I would imagine the maintenance issues and the replacement issues are often prohibitive. We might also look to Mediterranean cities that have incredibly hot seasons, that have invested in more permanent built infrastructural solutions for shade. So the deep shade of overhanging upper floors, the deep shade of courtyards, the deep shade of canopies that don't require the same intensive use perhaps of water in some cases, and that aren't as expensive to keep up. So of course, urban forests are part of the solution, but I think we also have to be unafraid to think in terms of built form. And a lot of times what I sense is that we make the dichotomy that we create just by habit between parks and the rest of the city, say even between, and I'm sure Norma can speak to this with more expertise, but even between the park and the sidewalk right next to it is too clean. And we need to start thinking of a more permeable relationship between spaces that we see as green and spaces that we see as built.
Which is interesting. You see, as you drive around in certain neighborhoods, at least, all the things that have come out on the sidewalk as part of the alfresco program, because that's totally not even the ones that are going into the street, but the way they've taken over the sidewalk. So it's been really wonderful to see. Barbara, I would really love to hear you also, though, share some of the conversation we had about the inequities in different neighborhoods who've been able to take advantage of that alfresco program, because it was so important to keep the economic vitality of different neighborhoods alive by keeping the restaurants alive, and that depended on who had access to sidewalks and parking lots and even the equipment to put in the safety in the streets. And I know we were going to talk later about it, but one thing we want to engage our listeners and attendees in is some of the ideas they can start thinking about in ways that they can participate and maybe even help be involved and in the different applications of programs in different neighborhoods.
Cool. Okay. So first I want to address the climate change discussion. You know, when I rushed my intro, I was talking about, tree canopy equity, and the street furniture contract. what I really was referring to in our we have a street furniture contract that basically was framed as that the contractor basically was getting money and was putting advertising in and basically on the west side, by where he was getting more money on the west side and downtown. So they were not putting any shade in the areas where people were really using these, the transit shelters. So we restructured the RFP so that it incentivizes the bidders to put shade in the communities that actually use the bus, not in the communities that are not using the transit. So that's a way where you change the infrastructure by redesigning the contracts that the city puts out to bid. And as it relates to tree canopy, is you have to same thing, is you have to design and be deliberate about saying, stating goals that any money we get, we're gonna basically put it in South LA. Any tree money we get, we're gonna get people to plant trees in South LA and in Koreatown, because that's where that's where the urban heat island effect is the worst. And with al fresco, what we did, and when I said that we're having that, even when we're investing dollars in targeted communities, we had $900,000 for our al fresco program, and we committed 50% of that funding to those targeted communities by focusing on the umbrellas and the resources there for those communities. For minority-owned businesses, even those restaurants didn't always benefit from it, because a lot of those businesses don't operate in their sidewalks, are not big enough. The infrastructure is not in place. A lot of the businesses or the streets at these restaurants in South LA, the infrastructure, it's over 25 miles an hour. So it is not conducive to put barriers and to make it safe enough to do a parklet on that street. So even though we said we were going to put some of these parklets, there's still some barriers to getting some of these, investments in those neighborhoods, because it takes more than just putting out some barriers. We actually have to, we could say to South LA, we want to help you. We want to help this restaurant, but we have to go out and knock on the door and say, do you want benches? Do you want some umbrellas? Do you want some, can we help you design? Do you want some tables and chairs to help with your business? It takes a lot of more work to work in some neighborhoods to help them see the value of these kinds of government programs to serve them.
Yeah, I think it's also really important that everything that we've talked about today, this just goes back to the question real fast, everything that we've talked about so far, and really everything that Civicas is concerned with, is a sustainability issue. Because being able to walk to amenities, being able to buy your groceries on foot if you're able, being able to have a local neighborhood that is capable of helping, to use the very, very old Jane Jacobs expression, keep eyes on the street. All of these things contribute to livable neighborhoods that are more sustainable. Even just getting people to be more locally invested is perhaps as essential or even more essential than things that we might think of automatically as green.
Agree.
I want to get back to some questions people are asking, specifically Barbara, about sidewalks and sidewalk repair and cleanliness. And, you know, people are talking about all sorts of programs from lots to spots. You know, there's a lot of really interesting solutions that have been seen in different ways in the past few years, and then specifically this summer. What are going to be our next steps in how we expand these things? You know, the city is obviously challenged economically as everyone else is, and the winter months are coming. If we could pivot a little bit to what we are going to try and do in the future based on what we're doing now, I would be interested to hear what your thoughts are on your next steps on several things.
I think it's how do we scale it up? I think with limited resources, I think that that's going to be the challenge, because as I alluded, you know, it takes longer when we invest 50% of resources in South LA. Even when we invest $450,000 in South LA, it's not enough. We have to invest 5 times more, because we have, you know, we haven't invested in that neighborhood, you know, for decades. So what we need to be investing is 5 times fold. So, and it takes longer for restaurants to respond, where it takes us 5 times longer to get a restaurant to agree to sign up for al fresco. In the West Side, we have 5 times more restaurants participating that actually don't even need the resources. So what we're looking at is a hybrid approach, allowing restaurants who can afford to do it to continue doing it, and then targeting certain restaurants with providing kind of a white glove approach with some additional outreach, and then hopefully partnering with some, you know, some nonprofits and some design, you know, associations to help us, you know, provide support for a lot of these restaurants, and these walk them through the process to continue supporting them with this technical support, with, you know, because we've had support from to help them, you know, do you need tables and chairs? Do you need someone to help you fill out the form? You know, do you need, sometimes they just need help filling out the forms. Some of them don't have a parking lot. Some of them need, you know, just shade. It's figuring out what they need is the first step. So that's some of the things, but the other one is just figuring out how much resources we're actually going to have available. And, you know, November's around the corner, and we'll know if we're going to have federal support to support us or not, and continue going back to the basics of just trying to reinvest in keeping, for me, is just keeping back to the basics of using the data to demonstrate that we need to continue investing in the most needed communities, because otherwise we can't go back to the way we've been investing in communities. There's no
question of Barbara. Do you still face the issue when you want to plant street trees that you need permission from the landlord of the property where the street tree is going to be planted? I'm asking this because back in the late 1990s, I had collaborated with Los Angeles Conservation Corps for an improvement program that involved not only trees, but it was a Lani neighborhood in Pico Union, the Byzantine Latino Quarter. And we had funding for 300 trees, but we had to have the signature and permission from every landlord. And in inner city neighborhoods where there are a lot of absentee landlords, you cannot find them. You cannot get the signature. So we ended up planting only 100 trees, even though there was funding and money for 300 trees because of this constraint.
we tried to solve that. We've increased, like, we've tried to move away from that, from that issue. We've increased kind of watering crews. So we're trying to, because of that problem. So we have watering crews now, because of that issue. And you'll see in our budgets that we have people that just go around and water trees around the city, and people think it's ridiculous, but if that's a big issue, if that's a maintenance issue, and if we can't, and it's an establishment issue, and Jen, who's on the call, ends up like, we just did a big pitch to a big bank and saying, if we don't establish these trees, the establishment period is critical. Exactly. If we don't do that establishment, they won't survive. Why plant these treres?
Ray's question too, actually. So I would like to ask again about, go back to, and before you were on, I was talking about the C40 mayors talking about the agenda for green and just recovery, which lays out so many great ideas that people are talking about all over the world, and especially here. And one thing that last week there was a webinar about carbon neutral cities with mayors from Bogota and Sierra Leone, and the idea that we need to have this global conversation, but that the solutions are local. And even in our city, we can have a global conversation, but by neighborhood, there will be different solutions. And that we want to talk about as we come back post-recovery, what are the infrastructure investments that we need to make? We know that we need to convert vacant spaces and open spaces into more habitable environments at a local level, at a neighborhood level, and also at a large regional level. But we also need to talk about water and access to water, and whether it's from the river and not coming from the Colorado River, but how do we have different programs within our waterway to capture and store and have access to water, or at the local level to supply water, drinking water to people. So I'd be interested to hear what you all think is going to be our approach moving forward on investing in infrastructure and really getting the buy-in from people at every level, from, on an individual level to a voting initiative level, from Proposition 15 to whatever we're going to be able to do, that, if hopefully we have administration that will support and be able to give access to channels of funding at different levels, from federal to state to local. Now we seem to have more collaboration amongst different departments and things, but what can the public do, and what can we all try to do so that we can have this vision of a city that's healthy and livable for all?
And Cynthia, I just want to say that an opportunity that we are actually moving very quickly to put forth to all of the cities in Los Angeles County, not a lot of money, but some seed money. As I mentioned, Measure A in regards to the park measure, we are going to come out with a $33 million grant program in several categories. And we want the public and private sector. This is to really stimulate that partnership between the public and private sector. And I think, and I'm going to try to merge your question as well. One is we're also going to put out an RFSQ for both private consultants, architects, planners, landscape architects, engineers, as well as nonprofits that know how to do this work. The problem is also many times the nonprofits know how to do this work, but when you're asking them to develop or come consult and get a project started, there is no seed money. So we will be putting out some technical assistance funding for all high need park poor communities specifically to really engage in really envisioning this type of work. And so we want to welcome both private sector consultants as well as our nonprofit sectors. And this is funding specifically dedicated for our park poor communities. And that's why that original slide that I had, that is very key too. We're also, part of that funding will also be for acquisition. This goes to Anastasia's point And I agree. I think one of the biggest successes that I had this year was trying to acquire a 0.7-acre parcel of land in the unincorporated Walnut Park in Southeast Los Angeles. It took me 10 years to acquire that parcel of land, going through 3 property owners. And the last time was really just begging because that community has no park. And this will be the first public park to serve over 17,000 people in that unincorporated area. We've done those small acquisitions. And so one is we've also acquired one in the Westmont unincorporated area. 5 years ago, the LA Times said that this was the capital of crime and murders in Los Angeles County. And we've also acquired another acre of land, Anastasia, so that we can build those parks. So another piece is that this funding will also help to provide seed money to do those types of acquisitions, specifically acquisitions in high need park poor communities. And lastly, the funding is also going to support multi-benefit projects. And this helps to really create sustainable communities and parks. How do we look at capturing water, treating water at our parks, using it for irrigation so that the cost of maintenance and resources is not heavy burdened on the local jurisdiction, as well as thinking about linkages and access to parks. And I just want to say another pilot example of this in the community of Willowbrook, which is an unincorporated community, predominantly African-American and Latino. Tomorrow is our grand opening. We've planted over 300 trees, 35,000 new plants, 80% of them is California native. And 2, we are unveiling, we are capturing water from El Segundo Boulevard, treating it, putting it back into our lake, which is a man-made lake, recycling it and using that water to irrigate the 35,000 new California native plants that we will be putting in. And so we believe that the environmental benefits of not just that green space, but really thinking about how we can smartly bring more canopy, bring more greenery in places that communities have not traditionally have seen these investments is the type of model investments that we want to ensure continue out throughout Los Angeles County. So please stay tuned because we want to make that investments and we want the public and private sector to help us create and replicate projects throughout Los Angeles County.
Thank you for sharing that. That's really exciting. We will definitely be sharing those updates on Civicas. And, you know, one of the things we talked about with this whole forum is starting the conversation and just informing people on a range of topics so that we could continue the conversation and have follow-ups. So we're very much looking forward to connecting architects and urban planners and citizens and nonprofits and all of the cross-sector participants and interested parties and people who couldn't make this and everybody, because it's really does take the entire community. So we will be looking to all of you to figure out how we're going to do follow-ups and who's interested and how we can participate in supporting a range of things from these parks and parklets and neighborhood spots to al fresco to, you know, the blue economy and things that they're doing in San Pedro with the water at Altasea and Lacey and all sorts of, you know, I liked what you were saying, Anastasia, about using technology. And, you know, when we're looking at what's going to happen next, we do have all this technology. We have all this data. We have all of the information that we need, basically. Now it's really about the will of bringing people together. And this is the opportunity. We cannot miss this opportunity. This is it. And we know that we don't have extra time for the climate. And we know that we need to reinvest in a clean and equitable and green and blue economy. And there's jobs there. There's lots of jobs. And part of what the UCLA has been talking about with net zero city, carbon cities, is that there's been, there was this one last week where the World Health Organization woman was talking about the subsidies we put forward to fossil fuels and without taking into account the public health costs of that. So we need to really restructure our infrastructure investment and all of our investments. And that's what I was interested in, what you've all been saying, that program you're mentioning for seed money, but you know, there's also federal programs. And does anyone want to talk about some of the propositions or other things that we could vote on that may, thank you, Barbara, that would be you.
So, I mean, you know, I think at the city, county, state, and federal level, there everybody has a roadmap, and I think, you know, at the city level, we have our, you know, our Green New Deal roadmap, and it's very, you know, we have a very clear roadmap for to achieving a health and a sustainable Los Angeles. I think the only thing that we need is resources. And I think we've been lucky that we have, as Norma alluded to, we have, you know, for parks, we have Measure A. For water, we have Measure W. For transportation, we have Measure M. And so in this budget climate, we're covered with those funding sources. With those limited funding sources. At the state level, I know they're talking right now about a bond and a resilience bond that would include a green jobs portion of it, which I'm completely, you know, and it would be, you know, I'm really excited about that portion of it because as we respond to the pandemic, I think we can't look at responding to the economy without looking at how, you know, in a resilient way, without looking at how it, you know, without looking at how we do it in a green, sustainable way, but looking at how it impacts the, you know, the jobs. And I think what better way than to look at the plans that we already have in place in our communities. So I'm really excited for that. So I think it's happening as we speak. So I'm looking forward to going up to Sacramento in the next couple of weeks to do that.
I know that Gavin Newsom has already put together, I was on another one with Verde Exchange the other day talking about even private investment, you know, and how we're going to have equity, you know, different funds of public-private partnerships to participate in this. So
Yep.
I'll ask you in the few minutes we have remaining, one, we want to think about what follow-ups are, but we will follow up with our networks and talk about that. But how can people feel you do have a lot of plans in place and there are a lot of great ideas out there? And I mean, even Alfresco program was something that was an academic, you know, proposal, and then it was on the books from the planners. And then this was the opportunity to put it into place. So there are all these great ideas and programs. What can people do to help move that forward in terms of resources, you know, in addition to the economic ones that are coming from the federal and the state? How can people align, you know, our motto at Civicas, and my personal one, is aligning missions to amplify resources. So we all navigate a lot of resources in our personal and professional and philanthropic and all of our other various personas. How can we align those resources to move action and these, you know, these priorities forward?
I mean, I think one of the ways is we can always use technical support, identify, you know, so that is one way. We can always use, we can always use design help for our parklets. And then we're also looking at, you know, we're looking at some bureaucratic things of whether we're going to rent or buy equipment. We're looking at a bunch of, you know, how do we streamline some of the processes that we use, you know, we have a lot of processes in place that we took out of the way, that we use our executive order, that we can use some help on how do we streamline, you know, post-pandemic, that you guys can advise us moving forward.
Like, for example, you were talking about needing shade structures or material supplies or design help. I mean, there's lots of things that, you know, or even job training or just a variety of things that need to happen to make these, you know, physical environments happen. And so certainly we have a lot of designers and planners and business owners and people with different sorts of resources at their disposal from their own.
Even signage. I mean, what kind of signage is, is gonna be durable enough that we can, that we can use? Right now, the signage that's being used for LA al fresco, the restaurants are printing on their own. They're printing it and printing it in their own printers and putting it in their restaurants.
And I was listening the other day, they were having something, I think it was with Salita Reynolds on KCRW, talking about al fresco, that now, since it was temporary, you had these plastic barriers in the street for safety. But I know that was one of the things you said, that, there's a limited amount of those because of the economic constraints. And so if we wanted to use more street space for open space, we need to come up with more things like that. So that's something that maybe the private sector through design and materials can help with. Is there going to be a way, like a menu of opportunities or some place that people can figure out how they can participate in this? Because that's certainly something we'd be interested in helping facilitate.
I mean, we're still in the pandemic, so those kinds of ideas in terms of we're in it. So ideas of post-pandemic helping us with that process is part of this discussion, is helpful.
I want to add.
No, I think one thing that we have to. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Anastasia.
That we are in academic institutions, and we have a tremendous resource for our students. And these students have to do capstone projects and theses, etc. And some of these are very relevant. And so you're very welcome. Actually, Barbara, you've mentioned about how you're trying to allocate bus shelters according to need and not according to revenue from advertisements, which is absolutely fantastic. I remember a capstone project of more than 10 years ago that really identified which are the bus stops that have, the heaviest numbers of lines and people coming in and out, and where should bus shelters be allocated. So I just extend an invitation to take advantage of some of these capstone projects, theses. You're very welcome to send short descriptions of things that you would like to have students work on with faculty supervision, and these are for free. So
okay,
that's one. I'm sure Marika can also supervise architectural students, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would just maybe say though that, I think we're going to have to figure out, and really, what Norma is talking about in very concrete terms is such an inspiration on this, but we need to figure out how to work through the pandemic. We cannot wait for the pandemic to end. We have to figure out how to move forward and make government work, and make private initiatives work, and make design work, make institutions work while we're going through this. And that is going to be critical to seize the moment that we're in. The other thing that I would say too is that in addition to the quote, free student work is not really free, actually. So I just want to be a little bit cautious there. But in addition to student work, we also have a huge talent pool in Los Angeles. We are so rich with talent in Los Angeles. And if we can put something together, even like a clearinghouse of like, oh, you need this, I can do that. There is, right now, I think it's very difficult to match resources with opportunities, and to match talent with opportunities to deploy that talent. And so that would be one concrete outcome that I would be thrilled so much, Cynthia, to see come out of this discussion today, is even just a kind of simple, even like a Craigslist for the city. Doesn't have to be fancy. That would help us do that, help us facilitate that work.
Well, and another thing I wanted to just add is, because we've been talking about this, and whether it's with the Mayor's Fund or whomever, that something I'm working on with Altasea, for example, is that we have a lot of this information, but part of the Green New Deal is also, and the plans that we have, is also using our creative partners and the creative economy that we have in Los Angeles to help communicate these issues. So whether it's signage in particular, or programs and, you know, just talking about these things in television shows, or any kind of the creative economy that is, you know, the artists that are here in all these different multimedia, we're doing that. I know down at Alta Sea about the water and the blue economy, and we certainly should be doing that about all of these issues, because this has been so illuminating, and I appreciate you all participating so much with what,
So,
you know.
So I think what she was referring to, so like for the al fresco program, like Christopher Hawthorne has been matching pro bono design firms with some of the restaurants. Is that what you're talking about in terms of like Craigslist?
I mean, the issue with that is that while I very much appreciate Christopher Hawthorne's efforts, and I think they're really essential. I love the fact that he has this new role in the city, and it's just very exciting to me, given his status as a critic and a voice for design in the city and beyond. The pro bono solution is not a solution. People are struggling. Firms are closing. That's not a sustainable solution. And so what we have to do is we actually have to marshal the resources that we have in the 12th largest economy in the world to make it work for our citizens, and not simply go to those who have resources to spare.
Thank you for that. On that note, we do want to, you know, talk about also in the future and our follow-up. That's very true. And also, you know, some of the things that we were talking about, that our mayor is a leader of C40, and how can we get that information out to more of our citizens, and, you know, come up with programs that are equitable for everyone to support all the different aspects of our economy, the creative economy, the blue economy, all of that needs to be part of a healthy civic space conversation and an economy going forward. So I know that we'll all be sending out information and follow-ups to our networks, and we look forward to hosting a follow-up conversation, and anyone who would like to participate in that. And thank you for all of your interesting and pertinent questions and answers and suggestions. I hope everyone stays safe and well, and we welcome your suggestions about next steps and how we can help make a more equitable city for everyone. So thank you so much to all of you and to our panelists. And, you know, Mark apologized for not making it, but we ended up with a fantastic panel of amazing women, and I really appreciate this conversation and your time and energy and efforts. Thank you.
And just, I want to thank our academic, Anastasia, Marika. You all are, you know, the guides to our work as practitioners. So just want to acknowledge all of your work to really lead this work and guide our work as practitioners. So thank you.
Yes.
Such great policymakers, you know, that's really inspiration too. So
I really like the format of this, from academic to policy to implementation. So thank you, Barbara, for making the time. And
Yeah, sorry I was so late.
no, it's always so interesting to see how it all plays out. So we will continue the conversation, and we'll just, you know, everyone stay safe and well, and hope for the best in November.
Thank you so much, Cynthia.
Thank you, Cynthia.
And this will be on our recording on civicas.net.